The wind howled across the snow-covered plains, sweeping icy daggers into the night. A small cabin stood alone, smoke curling weakly from its chimney. Inside, a fire flickered, but outside the storm raged mercilessly, and the land felt like an endless sea of white sorrow. Through the blizzard, a figure stumbled. An Apache woman, her braids heavy with snow, wrapped in tattered hides that could no longer keep the cold at bay. Her lips trembled, her breath a faint mist, each step heavier than the last as she neared the distant cabin. Her strength faltered, but desperation carried her forward. She reached the door and pounded weakly, her voice breaking the silence of the storm. "I'm freezing. Let me in." The plea was raw, carried by fear, hope, and the ache of survival against the merciless cold. The door creaked open, revealing a cowboy, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. He looked at her, shivering, fragile yet fierce beneath the storm's punishment. Without hesitation, he pulled her inside, shutting out the wind. Warmth enveloped her like a forgotten dream. She collapsed near the fire, her fingers trembling as heat reached them. Tears stung her eyes, though not from the cold anymore. He draped a heavy blanket over her shoulders, his voice low and steady. "You're safe now." She looked at him, memorizing that moment forever. Her voice cracked as she whispered her gratitude, words in both Apache and English. The cowboy simply nodded, his actions louder than promises. She had begged the storm for mercy and found it, not in nature, but in the kindness of a stranger who opened his door. The fire roared as he stoked it higher, casting shadows that danced along the log walls. She pressed closer to the heat, feeling life return to her body. For the first time in weeks, her bones stopped aching from frost. She knew she would never forget this night. He set down a bowl of stew before her, steam rising into the chilled air. She hesitated, pride tugging at her heart, but hunger won. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. He watched quietly, respecting her silence, understanding that survival often left no room for words. When she finished, he asked gently, "Where's your family?" Her eyes clouded with pain. She shook her head, unable to answer. Loss clung to her like the storm outside, a weight too heavy to name. He didn't push. Instead, he let the fire speak for them both. She finally whispered, "Gone, all gone." Her voice cracked under the truth. He lowered his gaze, his hand resting on the table as if anchoring himself against the sorrow he saw. He knew that ache. He carried it too, in scars invisible to the world. The cabin grew quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the storm raging beyond the walls. She leaned closer to the warmth, clutching the blanket. He looked at her, not as a stranger anymore, but as someone whose soul echoed his own. She whispered again, softer this time. "Thank you." "For letting me in," he nodded, his eyes meeting hers. Anyone would have. But she shook her head, knowing many would have turned her away. In that storm, his choice had meant the difference between life and death. He poured her water, setting it beside her hand. She drank slowly, her trembling easing. The cowboy leaned back in his chair, the firelight softening his rugged features. She thought then that he looked less like a stranger, and more like a promise she didn't yet understand. Outside, the wind howled louder, clawing at the cabin as if demanding her return. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her heart. The warmth, the food, his presence, these things felt fragile, as if they could vanish at dawn. But she etched them into memory. As the night deepened, exhaustion overcame her. He spread out furs near the fire, gesturing for her to rest. She hesitated, her pride resisting again, but her body gave in. She lay down, the crackle of flames a lullaby she hadn't heard since childhood. The cowboy remained awake, sitting quietly by the window. He watched the storm thrash against the world outside, his thoughts heavy. When he glanced back at her, curled beneath blankets, he whispered words only the fire could hear. "You'll never freeze again." She stirred in her sleep, her lips moving faintly, repeating her plea. "I'm freezing." "Let me in." He clenched his jaw, realizing those words weren't just about the storm. They were the echo of a soul begging not to be left alone in the coldness of life itself. By dawn, the storm broke. Sunlight spilled across the plains, glinting off snow like shards of glass. She awoke to warmth, to the smell of coffee, to the cowboy's steady presence. For the first time in months, she did not wake to fear, but to safety. She sat by the fire, watching him pour coffee into 2 mugs. He slid one across the table, their fingers brushing briefly. She caught her breath at the touch. It was small, almost accidental, yet it sparked something she would never let slip from memory. The days stretched, and though the storm had passed, she did not leave. He didn't ask her to go. Instead, he taught her small things, how to mend tools, how to split logs with less effort. She showed him her knowledge of herbs, healing roots she carried with her. Their worlds, once so separate, began to entwine. She told him of the songs her people sang to call back the sun, and he shared cowboy ballads sung under starry skies. Their voices mixed in the cabin, weaving a harmony that silenced the loneliness in them both. But at night, when the wind rose, she still whispered the words she had first spoken at his door. "I'm freezing. Let me in." He would answer each time, his voice soft but steady. "You're in. You'll always be in." His promise wrapped around her like a second fire. As weeks passed, she began to smile again, her eyes shining with something beyond survival. He noticed, and each time his chest tightened with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. What had begun as chance had grown into something neither could deny. One evening, as snow melted into streams outside, she whispered, "I'll never forget the night you saved me." He looked at her, his gaze firm. "Then don't. Remember it as the night I promised you'd never be alone again." She touched his hand, sealing the vow. The river thawed, birds returned, and the cabin filled with life again. She gathered herbs by the water. He worked the land with his hands. Together they carved a rhythm, and each day felt less like borrowed time and more like the life they had been meant to live. Yet in her heart, the memory of that storm never left. The fear, the cold, the desperation, it lingered. But it was tempered by his answer, by his open door, by the fire that had kept her alive. It became a memory not of death, but of rebirth, and she knew then that promises made in firelight and storms were the ones that outlasted all others. His vow, born in a night of desperation, had become her compass. She would never forget, nor let it fade, for it was the promise that saved her soul. The spring thaw gave way to greener days, and the cabin became more than shelter. It became a home. She decorated its walls with woven patterns of her people, while he carved simple wooden figures for the mantel. Together they shaped a place that reflected both worlds. She often returned to the riverbank where snow had once buried her feet. Now wildflowers grew, and she would gather them in her hands, their colors bright against her dark braids. Each petal reminded her of life reclaimed, of a promise born from winter's cruelty. One afternoon, he returned from the fields with a small bird cupped in his palms. Its wing was broken. She gasped softly, taking it gently. With herbs and bandages, she healed it day by day until it flew again. He watched her, realizing her spirit was just as healing. When the bird soared into the sky weeks later, she smiled, her face radiant. "Even broken things can fly again," she whispered. He stepped closer, replying, "So can hearts." She blushed, but her heart beat wildly, echoing the truth in his words. At night, the stars filled the sky, vast and endless. They sat side by side, her head resting against his shoulder. "I used to fear the silence," she confessed. "Now I welcome it, because you're here." He kissed her hair gently, sealing her words with quiet devotion. The seasons cycled, and with them, their bond deepened. He taught her how to ride long distances, her laughter carrying through the plains. She taught him the ways of the earth, how every plant spoke if one listened. They became teacher and student, partners in all things, but shadows lingered. Travelers passed with cruel eyes, whispering about an Apache woman with a cowboy. He held her hand tighter, his gaze daring anyone to judge. "Let 'em talk," he said. "They weren't there the night you knocked on my door." She smiled through tears. One night, when firelight flickered low, she confessed a dream. "I saw you leaving." The cold came back. He pulled her close, his voice fierce. "Darlin', I'll never leave you in the cold again." His vow carried the same weight as the first night, unbroken, unshaken. When summer bloomed, they built a garden together. Cornstalks rose tall, beans climbed poles, and herbs filled the air with fragrance. She tended it with care, remembering her people's traditions. He watched proudly, knowing their survival was no longer a struggle but a joy, the cabin filled with music and laughter. Sometimes she sang in Apache, her voice carrying like prayer. He strummed a guitar, rough and imperfect, but she adored every sound. Their songs wove together, proof that two worlds could blend into something beautiful. One day, while fishing at the river, he pulled out a small carved token, a wooden heart, rough but true, with her name etched inside. "For you," he said simply. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched it, whispering, "I'll never forget this." Never. As autumn arrived, they prepared for winter. She gathered herbs, dried meats, and wove blankets from hides. He chopped wood until his muscles ached. Each act was not just survival. It was devotion, proof that neither would face the cold alone again. On the first snowy night, she stood at the window, watching flakes drift silently. He came up behind her, wrapping arms around her waist. "This time," she whispered, "the snow feels like a friend." He kissed her temple. "Because you know you're warm inside." The storm outside grew wild, but inside the cabin, fire burned bright. She turned to him, her eyes glowing. "I remember that night, the night I begged. And you answered." He looked into her soul, replying, "I'd answer you every time until my last breath." The years passed, and with each season, their love only grew. Hardships came, but none could erase the bond forged in firelight and snow. For her, that night remained the cornerstone of everything, proof that one promise could change the course of a life. When their first child was born, she held the baby close, whispering, "You'll never know loneliness. You'll never know the cold." He stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. Together they swore to pass down the vow that had saved them both. Their children grew strong, learning both languages, both songs, both ways of living. Around the fire they listened to the story of the storm, of the night their mother said, "I'm freezing, let me in," and their father answered with "forever." It became family lore. Sometimes late at night, when silence filled the cabin, she still whispered those words. He, even half asleep, would answer with the same steady promise. The ritual never faded, even as gray touched their hair. It was the heartbeat of their love. She often thought of her people, of the ones she lost. Though grief never vanished, it was softened by the life she had built. And each time sorrow threatened to overtake her, she remembered the cowboy's door, his fire, his words that carried her through. On a quiet autumn evening, as leaves turned gold, she told him, "I'll never forget your promise." He took her hands, pressing them to his chest. "And I'll never let you." Their eyes met, filled with years of love, and the vow burned brighter than ever before. Winter returned, fierce as ever, but the cabin stood strong. She looked out at the snow and remembered the night that had begun it all. Instead of fear, she felt peace. She had a fire, a family, and a man who had kept his vow through every storm. One bitter night, as the wind howled, she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her children slept soundly nearby. She leaned into him, whispering the words she always did. "I'm freezing. Let me in." He kissed her hair, answering as always, "You're home." The years aged them gently. Wrinkles lined their faces, and their hair turned silver, but their love never dimmed. Neighbors spoke of them as legends. The Apache woman and the cowboy bound by a promise born in snow, a love that defied the cruelty of the world. When their children had families of their own, the cabin echoed with laughter again. Grandchildren played by the river, their voices carrying into the woods. She sat watching, her hands folded in her lap, her heart swelling with the life that had grown from a single vow. On a summer evening, she told the children her story. She spoke of the storm, the desperate knock, the words that carried her through the door of death and into love. Their eyes widened, and when she finished, they said, "Grandmother, he saved you." She smiled. "Yes," she whispered. "But more than that, he kept me." Her gaze found him across the yard, splitting wood though his body had grown weary. She saw the same man who had once opened a door without hesitation, and her heart burned as brightly as it had that night. The seasons turned again. Their children built homes nearby, but the cabin remained the heart of the family. She filled its walls with herbs, laughter, and the warmth of countless fires. He filled it with strength, stories, and the same vow he had spoken long ago. In quiet moments, when the world seemed to slow, she would close her eyes and remember that night. The fear, the cold, the desperation, and then the door opening, the firelight spilling out, his hand reaching for hers. It was the night her life began anew. As time wore on, his body grew weaker. One winter evening, as snow drifted softly outside, he lay by the fire, his breath shallow. She sat beside him, holding his hand, her tears falling silently. "Do you remember?" she whispered. "You let me in." His lips curved into a faint smile, his voice barely a whisper. "And I never let you go." With his last strength, he squeezed her hand, sealing the vow one final time. Then he closed his eyes, the firelight reflecting on the man who had kept his word. She wept, but her grief was not empty. It was filled with love, with memories, with the fire of 1,000 promises kept. She buried him by the river beneath the cottonwoods, carving his marker with the words that had bound them together. Forever warm. The winters felt colder without him, yet the fire never went out. She told his story to her children and grandchildren, keeping the vow alive. And every night when she whispered, "I'm freezing," "Let me in," she felt his answer in her heart. "You're never alone." Years passed. And when her time came, she lay down by the river, her eyes closing to the same song of wind and water that had carried her all her life. Beside her husband, she found her rest. The land held them both, two souls forever bound by a promise. Travelers passing the cabin often spoke of its warmth. They said you could still feel love in its walls, hear laughter in its rafters, and smell smoke that never seemed to fade. Some swore that on snowy nights you could hear a woman's whisper at the door, "I'm freezing. Let me in." And if you listened closely, you would hear a man's voice answering from within, "You're home." The legend became part of the land, carried by the wind, whispered by rivers, remembered in every snowflake that fell upon the earth. The promise was never forgotten, not by her, not by her children, not by the land itself. It endured because love, once spoken in truth, outlasts time. The Apache woman's plea and the cowboy's vow had become more than a story. They were a testament that even in the coldest nights, kindness can open a door. That even in storms, love can be born. That sometimes a promise is all that stands between despair and life, and when kept, it becomes the fire that warms generations. And so the story lives on, carried by firelight and memory. A woman who begged to be let in, and a man who answered forever. Their love, their vow, their warmth, they became eternal, written not in books, but in the hearts of all who heard the tale.